Well, I think President Putin was emphasizing certain things that we in the West don't really pay enough attention to. First of all, he's emphasizing strategic interests in the broad sense. We tend to personalize everything, and that's ridiculous. It doesn't make any difference whether the leader of the United States or Great Britain or any other sovereign state and the leader of Russia love each other or hate each other. What counts are interests, strategic interests. We've gotten away from that because, frankly, I'm talking about the United States, we're not pursuing our strategic interests. We have no strategic interest in eastern Ukraine. In fact, one can make the argument that the only real strategic interests we have are in prosperity, peace, and stability, all of which are inextricably intertwined. We are preeminently a commercial power. People talk about the American empire. Well, it's much like the British Empire in the sense that we are a commercial empire. Now, if we're failing, it's because we've lost sight of the commercial purposes of our outreach. We've substituted military power for economic influence and investment. We've substituted military power for cultural and political understanding and cooperation. So I think that's part of why Tucker did what he did. I mean, let's face it, we've been listening to all sorts of terrible things about this man, Putin, and people eagerly inhale all this nonsense, instead of listening to the man who is currently the Russian head of state. And what's his principal message? We have been here since 932. We are not going anywhere. We will continue to exist. Understand that. We want to live with you. We want you to live with us. We're not the same. But our interests and your interests do not necessarily conflict. We have no interest in Eastern Europe. We're not interested in a war in Eastern Europe. And of course, as you and I have talked before, all you had to do was look at the initial stage of this Russian special military operation. When they went in with a very small force. Only 90,000 combat troops. There were 200,000 involved, but only 90,000 who actually do any fighting. And they were very anxious to have a settlement. And they were very close to reaching a settlement. And then Boris Johnson, at the behest of the United States government, flew in to effectively destroy the agreement, which he did, and ensure that the war would continue. And he made a number of statements in private to Zelensky, which were wrong and fundamentally false. And those statements are the things we tell ourselves. Russia is weak. The Russian economy is weak. The Russian people don't support the government. They will not withstand the might of the United States and its allies. We have more economic power, more influence and the support of the people. All of that, of course, has ended up on the ash heap of history. Russia is enormously powerful. Why? They have an abundance of resources that they can draw upon. They have a population that loves the country. They're Russians. They believe in themselves. They believe in their religion. They believe in their country and their leadership. Does that mean that they all love Putin? Certainly not. But they believe in what they are and they're willing to fight for it. So we set up Ukraine for failure and we've destroyed that nation. We've killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians needlessly. We've driven half the population out of the country, probably 1 million plus wounded on top of the more than 500,000 dead. It's a catastrophe. And you know what? At some point, the United States will do what it has always done. Leave. We just leave. We are preeminently a maritime power and an aerospace power. When things don't go our way, we pack up and we go home. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. And so that's one of the reasons we've tried to fight this war against Russia on the cheap at the expense of the Ukrainian people. And I would argue at the expense of the Europeans, whose economies are in ruins. So in sum, I have not much more to say except that this is what's going to happen in the future. We will just leave. And then the Europeans are going to have to sort out whatever remains. And I don't know what that'll be. I can't predict that with certainty because if you sat down with Putin today, and this should have been very clear from that interview, and said, look, we want to put an end to this. You could say to Putin, you draw the line that you think is commensurate with your strategic interests. And then we'll draw our line and we'll come to some sort of agreement. And no one's willing to do that, but that's the quickest and easiest way to end the war. because we're not going to attract any positive investment into Ukraine to restore any measure of civilization there until this is over.
You know, I had General Flynn on the show 2 days ago, and he heard Putin talking about his interest to join NATO and how they were continually rebuffed administration after administration. And he corroborated that. He said, yeah, that is what I understood happening as well. And so, again, for the first time ever, we almost got a lens into Putin. And like you said, he's not this kind of big bad wolf that everyone kind of inhaled the story there. You could actually, I believed him that he was rebuffed by various U.S. administrations when he was actually trying to find some way to settle so he could move forward as well. So I found that very interesting as well.
Well, you know, one of the things that we ought to keep in mind, both you and the British and the other Europeans and Americans, is that this man, Putin, is by far the most Western-friendly leader that you're going to see in Russia. He's someone who's lived outside the country, traveled extensively. You know, he's personally familiar with other long-standing successful leaders like Modi in India or Xi in China. He understands the geopolitical environment very well. He understands economics very well, which is why I mentioned Alistair MacLeod earlier, who really understands what Putin is doing in financial terms. But he's friendly to the West. He wants to live with the West. If he vanishes and someone else takes his place, the probability of a successor being far more difficult to deal with and less informed about the West is very high. We should take that into consideration.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we could see that quite plainly in that conversation. And so I'm so glad that that happened. Just moving to other topics, because these are important things. Where are we at right now in the Middle East? We're now how many months in? Almost 5 months into this campaign at this point. What do you see happening, and what are these potential dangerous ramifications?
Well, what began as a response to the horrific attack of 7 October was transformed very quickly into an operation designed to either expel or kill the Arabs living in Gaza. I think we need to come to terms with that reality. That's the truth. And when Prime Minister Netanyahu talked to the Israeli population and described the people there as in Gaza as animals, that was widely embraced by the Israeli population. People frequently say, well, if Netanyahu goes, everything will change. And I keep trying to persuade people that they don't understand the level of support inside Israel for what is happening in Gaza. It's real. Whether you like it or not is another matter. It's just it's a fact. I don't particularly like it, and I think it's a mistake for the Israelis to do what they're doing, but that's where we are. I see no evidence that that mentality is going to change anytime soon. So where do we stand? Well, one of the things that's happened recently that we should have paid a lot of attention to, but got very little coverage here in the West, was Mr. Erdogan's visit to Egypt. Remember, it's been 13 years since Erdogan and the Egyptians have sat down to talk about anything. There was a lot of bad blood on the street because of the removal of Morsi, who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Remember that Mr. Erdogan leads the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. By the way, he also leads it in North America. And he went to essentially bury the hatchet, as we say, with Egypt, with Sisi, and also at Sisi's invitation, because General Sisi's in a lot of trouble. He has to renegotiate his debt, which is considerable, and he needs our help and assistance with that. But he's also got a problem with his own population. So the discussions that went on, yes, they addressed the oil and gas resources offshore. They addressed the issues in Libya. But then they turned to Gaza and the security implications for Egypt. Egypt is a nation of 100 million. They're probably living on infrastructure designed for 40 million. None of the ruling elites in the Arab world anywhere want a war with anyone, least of all Israel. The problem is that the population in Egypt is very enraged about what is happening in Gaza. Now, they haven't marched into the streets in great numbers yet to demand the removal of General Sisi for his failure to act. But I think by the time Ramadan is over, we're going to see tremendous movement on the part of both Turkey and Egypt, as well as in Jordan and Syria and elsewhere among the Arabs and northern Iraq, to coalesce into some sort of arrangement directed at Israel and potentially against us. I'm talking about the United States, because we are seen as unconditionally supporting, which is true at the moment, whatever the Israelis want to do. And that's your first decisive step in the direction of a regional war. We haven't even talked about the very high probability of an Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon designed to push Hezbollah north of the Litani River and apparently to pulverize Lebanon in general into submission. I think that's coming, because having gone as far as Mr. Netanyahu has, he really can only escalate. If you do anything other than escalate, you're seen as backing down, as retreating. So he believes he has a strategic advantage. His strategic advantage is control of the United States and its armed forces. As long as he can guarantee that backstop, he's comfortable taking on other opponents in the region. Most important, right up front, Hezbollah. But once Hezbollah becomes engaged, it's not only Egypt and Jordan and the peninsular Arabs and the Turks who are discontented and unhappy with what's happened in Gaza and are increasingly willing to act in some way. Now you bring Iran into the equation. The Israelis have always wanted desperately for us to destroy, quote unquote, Iran for them. We have refused repeatedly. We have walked away from it. Donald Trump in 2019 was presented with a fait accompli. One of the reasons that global hawk was flown on the edge of the air defense identification zone was to invite the Iranians to shoot it down. And they did. And in a court of international law, they have every right to shoot down an unidentified reconnaissance, intelligence, surveillance aircraft on the edge of their air defense identification zone. Mr. Trump declined the opportunity to go to war, even though at the time, the United States Air Force and other forces inside the Pentagon had already put together plans for the strikes. And he asked the question, very important one, if I do this, what happens? Yes. This is the thing we never asked when we went into Iraq. We never asked it when we went to Vietnam. In other words, always said, well, wait a minute, you want me to go over there and do this? What do you want me to do? How do you want me to do it? And what do you want it to look like when it's over? He asked, what happens next? And it wasn't just 5 or 6 or 7 or 800 people might be killed. It was obvious, we don't know, but there's a very high probability we'll be at war. Today, we are infinitely less prepared to wage a regional war than we were in 2019. Our army is in ruins. If you turn to the British Army, it's down to 72,000 men. They can't recruit. The army is a shadow of its former self. You have a similar situation in France. It's a bit larger. All the armies, if you will, in Europe are boutique forces. They're really designed to fight people who really can't fight back very well. All of a sudden, people are talking about, well, let's think about using them against Russia. Well, that went away very quickly if you paid attention to what happened over the last few days. The NATO members all rose up as one and said, thank you, President Macron. Go back to where you belong. Stop talking this nonsense. We're not going there. Well, now we have a similar situation in the Middle East, only it involves Israel and the United States. Perhaps the United Kingdom has interest in joining this. I don't know. But the point is that we are not going to engage with anything other than air and naval power. And the history of warfare suggests that if you use only air and naval power, things will look pretty much like they did before you started when you're finished. And then the real question is, if you begin to take losses, and I think we will, because if you look at what's happening right now in Iran, northern Iraq, parts of Syria, northern Lebanon, there is a major air and missile defense network emerging with new technologies and equipment coming in from Russia. Those air-to-air and missile defense weapon systems are effective. they will shoot down American military aircraft. Now, how many? I don't know. But it's been a long time since anybody shot us down. And if you go back to World War II, which I like to remind people of periodically when they ask questions, we and the Royal Air Force together lost 18,000 bombers trying to penetrate German air defenses. Today, people can't even begin to wrap their heads around it. If you go into a regional war with Iran and potentially the other states that I mentioned, I would not exclude Turkey by any means, you're going to lose considerable forces. How much have you got to lose before you're out of business? Do we have the scientific industrial base for mass production of aircraft and missiles and ships and everything else? And the answer is, I don't think we do. So we're really not prepared for this. And it looks as though this is a plausible outcome if things escalate and the Israeli Defense Force moves into southern Lebanon. Then they have three fronts: southern Lebanon, the West Bank of Palestine, and Gaza. Nothing is settled. Everything is still open. And just because nothing has happened yet does not mean that things won't happen in the future. And that's a huge mistake people make. Things take time to develop. Somebody said to me the other day, don't you think we're in a World War I scenario? I said, no, I don't think so. And he said, why not? I said, you had existing alliances, existing arrangements. And as Princip, the man that shot the Archduke, said, even if I hadn't done what I did, there would have been a war at some point. He was right. They were essentially loaded. The triggers were half cocked. They were ready to fire. That's not true right now in the Middle East. People were not planning on an existential war for survival against Israel. Today they are, but it takes time. And you have a different set of populations, a different set of leaders. So it may not make any difference what the leaders in the House of Islam in the West, in the Middle East want. It'll be a function of what the populations that live there demand. And increasingly, they're demanding ferocious action against Israel, and I would say the United States.
Wow. You alluded earlier that the U.S. has always been a commercial power. It's the one thing that we do better, and that in itself can be a weapon. And it seems like you said we've kind of lost that perspective when it comes to the actions in Ukraine. And when you talk about how Trump refused to go into that war with Iran, I see a businessman who's potentially running that country that is a commercial power. And again, typically people thought of the Republicans as being the hawks of war, but in fact, he seems to be making those decisions that are back to the commercial interests of the U.S., and that is not start these wars that seem to do only one thing: ruin commerce and drain the nation. I'm curious what you think of this upcoming election, as we're, I think, 9 months out. You have said to me last year that you don't even know if we're actually going to get to that election, and I think you game planned a few scenarios. We're in March now. I'm curious what your perspective is now as we go down this road to November. I guess it's 8 months until election. Then, of course, we have 2 more months, which could be the more interesting months before we have someone sworn in. So what is your perspective right now on this race?
Well, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge before we get to November. So let's keep that in mind. What could happen between now and November? We could face a serious fiscal crisis. We now are servicing our sovereign national debt of roughly $1 trillion a year, which is essentially what we're spending on defense and the intelligence apparatus. How long can this go on? I mean, the central bankers, we talked about them at the beginning, are happy to tell you it can go on in perpetuity. I'm not sure. And I think if you consult most financial analysts, they'll say no. Are we prepared to cut any spending to demonstrate to our creditors that we are serious about dealing decisively with the debt? No, we aren't. So what could precipitate? What sort of events could happen? Well, some people think we're already on the road now to a major banking crisis. That may be the case here inside the country. We've now admitted 10 million people to the point where we probably have 35 million illegals inside the United States. Our economy is not robust. We are not the nation of 1939, 40, 41. People say, well, what about the Depression? We came out of that. Even if we have problems, we'll still come out. So we have to understand that at the time of the Depression, we still had a very large, skilled workforce ready to go to work. Secondly, we had a huge manufacturing base. All we had to do is get it running again and put people to work. And then three, our creditors from the First World War, the people that owed us money, they were paying us from Britain and France and other countries in gold. We had a huge supply of it. What's happening now? Well, we don't have that manufacturing base that we once had. What about the skilled workforce? That's mixed. And worst of all, we now have tens of millions of people in the country that we really can't afford to maintain. And they're receiving free health care. They're receiving free transportation. They're receiving free housing. And the criminality is rising across the country in all the major cities. How anyone can look at this picture and not reach the conclusion that anything can happen between now and November is wrong. We haven't even talked about the exogenous events. Let's assume I'm wrong, that someone is stupid in Europe and provokes the Russians. I guess it's possible. I mean, even though the Europeans are now making it clear they don't want to go over there and fight, I don't know what could happen that might precipitate a collision with the Russians. That could be devastating because unlike us, they're ready. They're fully mobilized. They're prepared to put another 800,000 people into uniform. Their general staff is looking at it. I don't think that'll happen, but I don't know the answer there. I don't want to foreclose that option. Then you have the Middle East. What's happening in the Middle East? We're on this progression to regional conflict. If that should blow up suddenly in April, May, June timeframe, involving countries like Iran and Turkey, as well as other Muslim states in the region, even North Africa, what impact is that going to have? I mean, you know about this as well as I do. What happens to your supply chains when you can't get through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal? What happens to your supply chains if you can't get in and out of the Straits of Hormuz? I mean, we could talk for hours, but none of it is good. Everything is fragile. It wouldn't take very much. And once again, go back to the treasury bonds or the bond market. Go back to, you call them gilts.
Yeah.
Gilts. They're rising. The 10-year, which I always look at, most people look at carefully, is once again rising. This is bad news. How do you deal with all of this? So I think it's sort of a giant house of cards. And we just don't know which card is going to be kicked out underneath and then cause a collapse.